Hello there. So today we're going to make a badge, and what I've done is I've got some die cut circles. This one's going to be for the front and that one's for the back, and I've also got a die cut star, and these are in felt, and I have some iron on but sew through little die cut numbers because it's going to be a 50 badge. So what I'm going to do to start with is pick some embroidery floss and sew the star directly onto the front circle, and then when I've done that I'll come back and I will iron on the 50 and then sew around the 50, and when I've finished that and that's all in place, I'll then pop on the back and sew all the way round, leaving a small gap to stuff it with some polyfill, and then just close the gap, and then that will make a nice little 50 badge for the front of a card. I'm going to add a little brooch back on the back, and I'm considering adding a few little streamers of coordinating ribbon as well, so we'll see what that looks like, and I will be back to show you the finished product. So this is a quick look at the card with the badge on, and if you'd like to see the step-by-step instructions, they're going to follow next. So stage 1, thread your needle with some embroidery floss and tie a little knot at the bottom. I'm just using one strand, so you could just use normal sewing thread if you like. And what we're going to do is just remove the 50 there and the back, and I'm going to sew the star onto the front of the top bit of circle felt. So I'm just going to use a basic running stitch, trying to keep my stitches nice and neat around the edge of the star. You could use any stitch you like around the edge. Blanket stitch might look nice, or back stitch if you wanted to fill in the gaps. But as you can see, I'm just, if you can see, I'm just doing a basic running stitch around the edge. Okay, so now I've finished sewing that, and that's securely attached to the front piece of circle felt. What I'm going to do now is iron on these two little die cut fabric shapes. So first of all, I'm going to take off the paper backing and just lay them. You can see that there's a, I don't know whether you can see, but there's sort of a shiny coating on the side that I've removed the paper from. That's the adhesive. So I'm going to pop it adhesive side down onto the star. Just remove that from there. And because they're a bit fiddly to sew on, the adhesive backing will just hold it neatly in place for me, so that it makes it easier to keep them in the position I want them to be in. You could of course pin them, but because it's just such a tiny piece of fabric, it's it would be difficult to pin. So I've got them where I want them. I've turned my little travel iron on, my little homemade ironing board, and I've set it to the number 2 on my iron, so it's just a medium heat. No steam, obviously, with it being a travel iron, but you wouldn't want to use steam anyway. I'm using Heat and Bond Light as my adhesive on here, and I'm just going to pop my iron on there and hold it on there for about 6 seconds. There we go, and that's enough just to melt the adhesive and hold it in place. So that's actually done now, and it won't peel up while I'm sewing. So now I'm going to put this away and start sewing around the 50, just to make sure that that's held in place firmly. So I've chosen my embroidery floss for the numbers, and I'm just going to take a single strand and that should show up nicely, hopefully, and then I shall sew around the outside of the numbers, and I'll probably use a back stitch for that. Just knot the end of the thread and then start sewing from the back of the felt, and that keeps all the threads nice and neat. Okay, so now the 50 has been sewn in place using back stitch all the way around the outside of the numbers. You can see it looks a little bit of a mess on the inside, but that's now going to be covered because we're going to sew around the outside of the circle and sew it onto the back circle. And what we want to do is just leave about an inch space at the bottom without any sewing, so that's going to be a gap. So we'll sew all the way around and leave a gap. We're going to stuff that with some it's toy filling that I'm using. I think it's polyester toy filling, and then when I've done that I might add a few little ribbon dangles, and then what I'll do is close the gap with the rest of the stitching. So as before, just do a little knot in the end of the cotton, and just place the circles together, and I start stitching from the place where the opening will be. So I'm going to start here at the bottom, and I'm going to put my needle in from the inside of the blue piece, so the top piece of felt, and that way my thread is going to be covered, my knot is going to be covered. So I want to go right on the edge and start stitching from here all the way around and sort of finish about there. I'm going to keep my stitches nice and close to the edge and quite small, with a small gap, and that way the fluff isn't going to protrude out of the badge. Again, you could do blanket stitch, whip stitch, or back stitch. I just like the look of the running stitch, especially as I've already used it on the star. Okay, so I've sewn around the edge and I've left myself a little gap inside there to add the fill. So I'm going to just pop a little bit of fill in there, and that'll make it nice and puffy, so it gives it a little bit of shape. There we go. Oh, make a nice pin cushion, wouldn't it? Okay, now I've picked out some ribbon as well because I wanted some ribbon to go with the colours, and I've gone for some teal, some red, and I've got this orange which I hope will work. So cut a little bit of this. So I've gone for satin ribbon, and what I'm going to do is just cut the edges as a fishtail, like that. And let's see how long. Don't want it too long because it's going to sit on the front of a card, so let's make that a little bit smaller, about the same. One's about right, so we'll just cut this one. Don't just move those bits out of the way. And what I'm going to do is just pop them, fold them in half. Doesn't have to be perfect, but pop them together. Make a little dangly tail, and they are then going to sit inside that gap, and I'm going to sew it closed so that you've got a lovely little dangly tail. So what I might do is just pop a little stitch in the ribbon to hold them all together first, and that'll just make it a little bit easier when I'm sewing them in place. And then I'm not fiddling around with 3 pieces of slippy satin ribbon trying to get away from my grasp. There we go. So now I've popped a little stitch in those. That should be easier just to slip them in there and then sew straight past them. So what I can do is just use the same thread, and I'm starting from here because this is where I left off sewing before. So I'm just going to go in, leave a small gap next to my last stitch. So I'm going in, I've still got the ribbon attached there, so I'll need a little bit of thread just to let that in, and then I'm going to start stitching again. So I'm just going to go back into the back and then back through to the front again. And as I sew along, I'll naturally catch the ribbon in my sewing, and that will keep it in place. Inside the badge. Now obviously if you've done whip stitch or blanket stitch around the outside, at that point you're going to have to stop and just do straight stitch or back stitch across here. And that's it. I've just made it to the end, and that's got a lovely dangly tail on. And the last thing I'm going to do is just add a brooch back to the back, and what I think I'll do is just pick some thread that coordinates with the orange, and then I'm done, and that's the 50 badge ready for the front of the Happy Birthday 50 Today card. Thanks for watching. Bye.